Okay, where are we? Yes. Today we're looking at the question, who am I? And it's really quite a big question when you think about it. And the answer that we give, if each of us give an answer, it's bound to be varied depending on who we are and what role we play and what we do and all that sort of stuff. But here's a question, does or would that answer vary with age? Would a younger person think of themselves differently from an older person? And that brings me to the phrase generation gap, because it's a phrase that's been around for about 50 years now in the English language. And it tries to capture that gap of understanding between different generations. It's a gap that's sort of reflected in tastes in music or tastes in fashion or interests, things like that. And it's a gap which often creates misunderstanding, and sometimes it creates bad feeling. And today's reading is a classic case of misunderstanding. And at the very heart of today's reading, would you believe it, is Jesus himself. So today's reading is from Luke chapter 2, reading from verse 39, and it's going to be read for us by Jill Niven. Over to you, Jill.
Thank you. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord.
Mute.
I'm unmuted. They returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Thanks be to God.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Jill. Now, think about it. To an older person, this might look like a classic case of a typical young person being thoughtless and self-centered and irresponsible. Whereas to a younger person, it might seem like typical, overprotective, controlling parents being a bit whiny and embarrassing. I wonder how you respond to this story. Before we start taking sides, though, let's take a closer look at what's actually happening here. We're told that the whole family had gone, as was their custom, on their annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. That's what we're told. So this is a family thing, and it's something they do absolutely every year. It's part of their pattern, a bit like, going to the cottage in the Highlands every year or going somewhere every year. This is just what the family did. Jerusalem, when they got there, would have been packed full of pilgrims from all over the world, and it'd be in this general state of bustle and excitement. And on the way home, there would have been a big party of people who are all from Galilee, who are traveling along that road together. And Mary and Joseph wouldn't just have Jesus to think about, they'd have his brothers and his sisters to look after. And they would assume, it's a big party, there's other relatives there, there's cousins, Jesus would be with one of them. And it's only when they actually get to their camping place or their stopping place or wherever they're going to stay for the night that they realize there's no Jesus. And so we can imagine, as any parent would, it's like, it's a bit of a nightmare. This sort of growing sense of unease and anxiety. I mean, he's only 12 after all. So they start to ask around, have you seen Jesus? Have you seen Jesus? They start to search for him. No Jesus. It's getting dark. Now they're really worried. And you can't travel after dark because it's really quite a dangerous road, so they have to wait until dawn the next morning, a worried night they spend, and then at dawn the next morning, straight back to Jerusalem, where they search and they search and they search. No Jesus. And then after 3 days of searching, they finally end up at the temple. And there he is. And what's more, he seems to be deep in conversation with some religious people. And in a mixture of relief and irritation, his mother explodes. Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been searching for you everywhere. And now here comes the puzzling bit. Because Jesus doesn't just jump to his feet as any dutiful son, caring son would do and say, oh, I don't know what happened. Time just got away with me. How thoughtless of me. I'm really, really sorry. I got carried away. No, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say, oh, didn't you get my message? I sent it with my cousin. No, he doesn't say that either. He just looks up and he says, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house? Whenever I come across a bit of the Bible that puzzles me, I assume it's there for a reason. And I assume that I have to think about it. And I have to try and work out why this happened and what it all means and what I can learn from it. And so that means I've got to look for clues. And the clues are there in the passage that help us understand what's going on here. Because immediately we're thinking, well, that wasn't a very nice thing for Jesus to do. I thought he was meant to be perfect, you know. So here are the clues that I've noticed. First clue, verse 41. The family went to Jerusalem for the Passover every year. Which means, if you think about it, every year, Jesus, as he grew older and older and older, would have gone to the temple. Every year. It was a familiar place to him. Okay? That's the first clue. Second clue. Second clue is Jesus would already have been known by the people who hung around the temple. If you look earlier in Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, you're told about the fact that when he was brought as a baby, there was someone called Simeon who picked him up and thought, at last I have seen God's salvation. There was a prophetess called Anna who made some really striking prophecies about him. So that meant even at his birth, his name would have been noticed, and people would have checked out his lineage and tried to work out where he was from and who he was. And then every year he came back. So every year, people would have looked out for him coming back and talked about, oh, there's that young lad. Remember what Anna said about him? Remember what Simeon said about him? There he is. He's a bit older. They'd have sought him out. They'd have asked how he was. Clue number 3. He is 12 years old. He's 12 years old. 12 years old is a significant time in the life of a Jewish boy. It's a time when they're beginning to prepare for adulthood. They're recognized as being an adult on their 13th birthday. So their 12th year is an ambiguous sort of time. It's a sort of time between childhood and adulthood. It's teenage years shrunk into 1 year. So it's a really special time for Jesus. It's a momentous time. Clue number 4. We're told in verse 40, even as a young child, he was special. People noticed he was special. He was full of wisdom. God's grace was upon him. He was interested in people. He was different. He was special. He was perhaps more open to things that children of a young age are. So there are the clues. This is how I read it. For 11 years, this young lad has come to the temple, and for 11 years he has dutifully returned home with his parents. But this is now his 12th year. And so he allows himself to be drawn in by this circle of friends that he has made when he goes to the temple every year, drawn in to talk about things that he loves talking about. And these friends of his in the temple would have known how old he was. They'd have known the significance of his age. And so the word would have spread. Here he is in his 12th year. Why don't you come and meet him? He's really different. The religious leaders, the important people who ran things would have heard about him. Their curiosity would have been aroused. Oh, it's his 12th year. Wow, let's go and see what all the fuss is about. And they'd have asked him questions. And we're told that his answers amazed them. So there's this crowd around him by now. There's this sense that this is a big event. This is a big moment in Jesus' life. It's a big moment in the life of the temple. There's something special going on here. And then in storms his mom and dad. Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been searching for you everywhere. As I said, it's a classic case of misunderstanding. And at the root of the misunderstanding is an assumption about who Jesus is. I mean, think of his parents. Think of the events surrounding his birth. The appearance of angels, dreams, prophecies, miraculous nature of his birth, all that they'd been told about him even before he was born, all that had happened to him after he was born, the shepherds, the wise men, the flight to Egypt, all that stuff. The parents would have known all of that. Mary and Joseph would have known all of that. But years had passed. And their life in Nazareth had sort of gone back to normal. And with each passing year, those miraculous events of the past would have become more and more distant and less real. And I'm sure a big part of them would have felt a sense of relief at this. You know, that sort of, maybe Jesus is going to turn out to be normal after all feeling. Maybe that's an end to all this spiritual stuff, this religious stuff. And you can sort of sense that in Mary's words. Look at her words. Son, your father and I have been searching for you everywhere. I think those words are very significant because they tell us a lot about where Mary's coming from here. Son, your father and I? Had she not been told by an angel that this was going to be the Son of God? And yet she's saying, your father and I. And there's almost a hint of a rebuke in Jesus' reply. Look at his reply. Why were you searching for me? Why didn't you come here straight away? You spent 3 days wandering around, but you didn't come to the temple. Why didn't you come here straight away? And then he says, didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house? My Father's house. At the root of this misunderstanding is the question, who is Jesus? And I find this passage to be a real challenge. How often do I catch myself pigeonholing people because of their age, whether they're young or whether they're old, fitting them into a box that assumes I know who they are, that assumes I know what they think, that assumes I know how they're going to react, when really I should be paying more attention to the clues. I should be maybe listening better. I should be trying to understand who they are, trying to understand things from their perspective. Last week, we looked at the need for keychain leadership. This week's core commitment is better empathy. Better empathy. Empathy is the beginning of understanding. If we are to hang on to our young people, if we are to grow younger as a church, we need to be willing to empathize more with each other, whatever our age. At one of the Growing Young webinars, there's that word again, in case you didn't pick it up last week. One of the Growing Young webinars, there was a panel, and the panel was made up of older people and younger people, and people put questions to them to see how they responded. And one of the questions that was put to them was, what are the assumptions that people make about you because of your age that you think are the most unfair assumptions? What are the assumptions that are most unfair? The older people on the panel said that the most common unfair assumption that younger people make about them is that they are always very traditional in their ways. They thought that was unfair. They thought that was not true. The younger panelists said that one of the unfair assumptions older people tend to make about them is that they don't have much in common with them. And that's not true. You see, the truth is, if we look beyond things like music and fashion, we'll find that we actually have a lot in common, whatever age we are. Research has shown, for example, here's a good example. Research has shown only a third of young people actually feel they are cared for. Only a third of young people actually feel someone believes in them. Whereas at least a quarter of young people struggle with loneliness and isolation. Now, that's depressing, isn't it? But in my experience, it's not just young people who feel like that. Whatever our age, we tend to have a lot in common with each other and we don't realize it. Research has shown that the three questions that matter most to young people are firstly to do with identity. Who am I? Secondly, to do with belonging. Where do I fit in? Thirdly, to do with purpose. What difference can I make? Identity, belonging, purpose. And yet, if you think about it, aren't these not questions which we all struggle with? We actually have a lot in common and we don't realize it. And does our shared faith not provide us all with the same answers? Who am I? I am someone loved by God. Someone for whom Jesus died. Where do I fit? I am part of his family. What difference can I make? I can be part of his body on earth. I can be his hands, I can be his feet, I can have his heart for all that is good and just and loving and pure. I want to finish on a practical note, okay? If we want to grow younger as a church, we need to be willing to empathize more with each other, whatever our age. How do we do that? Well, the approach to adopt is not to make assumptions and jump to conclusions and to judge and do all the things that happen when misunderstandings arise. The approach to adopt is simply to realize that we are journeying together and we can learn from each other. The skill to develop is how to learn from each other, how to listen well, how to pay attention, how to ask the right questions. And above all, we need a willingness to take the time, to spend the time, particularly with people who are older or younger than us. And let me give you an example. And it's one of my favorite examples of, if you like, an intergenerational encounter that took place. And it took place years ago. It took place at our afternoon guild. The afternoon guild is for older guild members who cannot manage out in the evening anymore. And so people pick them up in cars and they bring them to the small hall in the Kirk Centre, and there's usually some sort of program of events. But once a year, they would invite a class of kids from Gracemont High School to come to tea with them. And so the kids from Gracemont High School, Adele Fleming, the RME teacher that would organize it all, they would all troop down with the chaplains, and they'd come in the door, and then we'd bring them through the small hall where all the afternoon guild members would be waiting at their tables, and we'd divvy them up so that every table had some people from the afternoon guild, some older people, and some people from the school, some younger people. And then we'd give them a quiz, which involved questions that you had, some questions the older people could answer, some questions the younger people could answer. And of course, the winning team won a prize, and they got really competitive, those teams. You know, Nick Blair was involved at one point. His team always seemed to win or come second. Ruth Davis, oh my goodness, force to be reckoned with. Somehow her team always came first or second. Really good fun. Really good bonding experience. And then after that, everybody had the tea. And it was like tea with your granny, because there'd be scones and cakes and juice and biscuits and all that sort of stuff. Now, the very first time we did that, I wasn't quite sure how it was going to work out. I'm not sure Andy was quite sure it was going to work out either. But at the end of it, Wilma Monroe came up to me, and she was really moved. Now, I don't know how many of you remember Wilma Monroe. Wilma Monroe died a few years ago, but she could be quite a formidable lady, quite scary. And yet, a couple of young girls had been sat at her table, and they'd chatted away and had cakes and done the quiz together. And Wilma came up to me and said, you know, towards the end, one of those girls turned to me and said that she had lost someone just recently. I can't remember who it was, Andy. It might have been her granny, or it might have been someone close to her. They had died. And she felt she could tell Wilma about it. And Wilma was totally bowled over by that. This young lass that she just met, but spent that time with, was sharing with her something that was really big in her life. And Wilma was able to be a granny to her. See, we have a lot more in common than we think. And spending the time can make all the difference. One of the things that we're hoping to see more and more of is what we'd call intergenerational interest groups, things that we do together that all ages can join in with. We have already set things in motion involving some of the folks from the Guild to set up a sort of home cooking and baking group. Again, it can draw in people from all ages. So, I mean, obviously the byproduct of that will be delicious cakes and bread, but the real purpose of that would be so that people of all ages can spend time together, get to know each other, and maybe share bits of their lives that they wouldn't have thought of. We've already set in motion a cycling group. Hands up if you like cycling. Hands up if you've got an old rusty bike in your garage. So, I mean, Chris will be saying a bit more of this in the announcements, but there's something that people from different generations can all do together. And there's other things that we can do. We've got walking groups, we've got other things, but maybe we just need to be a bit more intergenerational with them. Just creating situations where we can spend the time together. Why are we doing this? Well, because it's a chance to engage, to listen, and to discover that we've got a lot more in common than we imagined. So let's just take a few minutes now and reflect. Just a time of silence when we can think about what God might have been saying to us. We can ask ourselves questions like, who am I? How open am I to people of different ages, whatever age they are? How willing am I to build bridges of understanding? And I think probably the biggest question, how open am I to God's guidance and help? Just a few moments to think about these things, and then I'll say a prayer. We thank you, Jesus, that you are the Son of God. And we thank you that because of you, we can be a child of God, loved by you, part of your family, part of your body on earth. Help us to know this. Help us to accept the truth of this. And basing our lives on that foundation, help us to see others through the eyes of God as well. We ask this for Jesus' sake. Amen.